I never told my in-laws I own a $2.1 billion empire. They still treated me like I was nothing. So they invited me to Thanksgiving dinner to make me sign away my marriage. To prove I married their daughter for money. I let them finish every word. But the moment I slid the folder across the table, before I tell you what I put on that table instead of my signature, tell me where you're watching from in the comments. Grab a warm cup of coffee, sit down, and listen to the whole story. The drive up to the Holloway estate always felt like crossing an invisible border into a country where I didn't speak the language. It was a cold, bitter November evening in Connecticut. The trees were stripped bare, looking like jagged black veins against the fading purple sky. My wife, Chloe, sat in the passenger seat of my SUV, staring out the window. She had been quiet for the entire 2-hour drive from the city. I thought it was just the usual holiday stress. You know how it is when you're heading to the in-laws for Thanksgiving. You mentally prepare yourself for the subtle digs, the passive-aggressive comments about your career, the fake smiles. But this was different. The silence in the car was heavy, thick, and suffocating. I reached over and put my hand on her knee. "Hey," I said softly, "it's just dinner. We'll be in and out. 2 hours, tops, and then we go back home." She flinched slightly, barely turning her head. "Yeah, 2 hours." I didn't push it. I kept my eyes on the road as we pulled up to the massive wrought iron gates of the estate. A security guard in a heated booth checked my name on a clipboard, giving my 5-year-old SUV a look of mild disgust before pressing the button to let us in. The driveway was a long, winding path of crushed white gravel that crunched loudly under the tires. The house itself was a sprawling stone mansion that looked less like a home and more like a fortress. It had been in David Holloway's family for 3 generations. It was the kind of house that demanded you wipe your feet and lower your voice. When we walked through the heavy oak front doors, the smell of roasted turkey, sage stuffing, and expensive floor wax hit me. Eleanor, my mother-in-law, was waiting in the grand foyer. She was wearing a tailored wool dress that probably cost more than my first car. She didn't hug me. She never hugged me. She offered a stiff, practiced smile and extended a hand covered in rings. "Matthew," she said, her voice smooth and perfectly modulated. "You made it, and you wore the blue suit. How dependable." "Happy Thanksgiving, Eleanor," I replied, ignoring the jab. I handed my coat to a woman in a black uniform whom I had never met before. David, my father-in-law, walked into the foyer holding a glass of amber liquid. He was a tall, imposing man who had made his fortune in commercial real estate. He carried himself with the absolute certainty of a man who had never been told no in his entire life. "Matt," he grunted, giving me a quick, firm handshake that was designed to test my grip. "Traffic bad?" "Not too bad," I said. Elijah, my brother-in-law, appeared behind David. Elijah was the golden boy. He had the Ivy League degree, the perfect hair, and a high-level job in wealth management. He looked at me with a smirk that he had spent his entire life perfecting. "Hey, Matty, see you're still driving that old tank. Good for you, man. Carbon footprint and all that." I forced a smile. "It gets me from A to B, Elijah." We moved into the formal dining room. The table was easily 20 feet long, covered in a crisp white linen tablecloth, sterling silver cutlery, and crystal glasses that caught the light from the massive chandelier above. There were only 6 of us dining, but they had set the table as if they were expecting royalty. We took our seats. I was seated next to Chloe, directly across from Elijah. David sat at the head of the table with Eleanor at the other end. There was a 6th man at the table, sitting quietly to David's right. I recognized him vaguely. Samuel. He was the family's senior financial advisor and, occasionally, their lawyer for private matters. The staff brought out the food. The turkey was perfectly carved. The sides were arranged in ornate silver bowls. But nobody was eating. David picked up his wine glass, took a slow sip and set it down. The clink of the crystal against the table sounded like a gunshot in the quiet room. "Before we begin," David said, his voice echoing slightly in the large room, "there is a matter of family business we need to attend to." He nodded to Samuel. The advisor reached down into his leather briefcase and pulled out a thick stack of papers. He placed them on the table and slid them precisely across the linen until they stopped right next to my plate of cranberry sauce. I looked down. The document was printed on heavy, cream-colored stock paper. The title, typed in bold black letters, read, Postnuptial Asset Protection and Waiver Agreement. I stared at it for a long second, my brain trying to process what I was looking at. I looked up at David. What is this? Eleanor folded her hands neatly in her lap. That was the thing about Eleanor. She never raised her voice. She didn't need to. She had spent 60 years perfecting the kind of calm that made you feel the floor shifting beneath your feet. It's exactly what it looks like, Matthew, Eleanor said quietly. It's a safeguard. Sign it before dessert, or I promise you, David will have his legal team file the annulment and divorce papers by Monday morning. The silence in the room was absolute. I looked at the document again. 14 pages, drafted by the most expensive family law attorney in Connecticut, designed to strip me of every single marital asset if my wife and I ever separated. They had placed a silver pen right next to it, like it was a piece of silverware. I turned to my right to look at Chloe. I expected to see shock on her face. I expected her to stand up, to yell at her parents, to grab my hand and tell me we were leaving. But she didn't move. She was staring down at her lap, her face pale, her hands trembling slightly. Chloe? I whispered. She wouldn't look at me. She just swallowed hard and kept her eyes glued to the table. Across from me, Elijah let out a low chuckle. Don't look at her, Matt. Look at the paper. It's time to face the music. To understand how we ended up at this table, playing this twisted game of financial Russian roulette, you have to understand where I came from. Because the Holloway family looked at me and saw a category, not a person. They saw my background and they made their assumptions. I wasn't born into a family with a name that opened doors. I didn't grow up in houses with grand foyers or security gates. I grew up in a cramped, two-bedroom apartment in Akron, Ohio. The kind of neighborhood where you locked your doors twice and the heater sounded like a dying car engine all winter. If it broke down in January, you slept in your winter coat and prayed for an early spring. My father walked out on us when I was 4 years old. I don't remember much about him, just the sound of the door slamming and the loud silence that followed. It was just me and my mother. She worked double shifts at a local diner, carrying heavy trays of meatloaf and coffee until her feet swelled and her back ached. I remember sitting at our tiny, scratched kitchen table late at night, doing my homework under a flickering bulb while she sat across from me, rubbing her temples and counting dollar bills and quarters from her tip jar. She was trying to see if we could afford fresh vegetables that week, or if we were eating canned beans again. She didn't have a college fund set up for me. She didn't have an inheritance to pass down. What she had was grit. She taught me that nobody in this world owes you a damn thing. You earn your keep, you respect people, and you never, ever let anyone make you feel small just because your pockets are empty. When I was 21, my mother got sick. Really sick. The kind of sickness that drains whatever small savings you have and leaves you with nothing but medical bills and despair. I was a junior in college, studying computer science on a partial scholarship and working 2 jobs to cover the rest. I dropped everything to take care of her. I remember the day of her funeral. It was pouring rain. There were only 6 people there, mostly her old coworkers from the diner. I stood by her grave in a cheap, ill-fitting black suit I had bought at a thrift store. The rain soaked through my thin shoes. I stood there shivering, looking at the cheap headstone, and I made a promise to her. I promised her I would build something real, something lasting. I promised that I would never be helpless again, and I would never let anyone look down on the blood and sweat she had poured into raising me. After the funeral, I didn't go back to working regular jobs. I went into a dark, cramped computer lab at the university and I started coding. I founded Velar Systems when I was 24. I didn't have venture capital backing. I didn't have rich friends. I built the back-end infrastructure for data processing out of a rented garage. For 3 solid years, I lived on a salary of absolutely zero. Every single penny I made went straight back into the servers. I ate ramen noodles, I slept on a mattress on the floor, and I worked 18-hour days. I was terrified of failing, but I was infinitely more terrified of going back to the life of counting quarters at a kitchen table. Slowly, quietly, the company began to grow. By the time I was 30, Veeler had become a monster. We weren't a flashy consumer app. We built the secure back-end systems that major financial institutions relied on to process millions of transactions a day. If you swiped a premium credit card, or if a bank approved a massive commercial loan, there was a very high probability that my software was routing the data. But I made a deliberate choice early on to stay out of the spotlight. I structured the holding company with layers of LLCs and shell corporations. I didn't want my face on the cover of magazines. I didn't care about the fame. I just wanted the security. I kept driving my old SUV because I liked it. I wore plain clothes because they were comfortable. I didn't need to wear a Rolex to know what time it was. That was the man I was when I met Chloe at a technology conference in Chicago. She was attending with some friends. She was beautiful, yes, but she also seemed incredibly grounded. She laughed easily. She didn't ask what I did for a living within the first 5 minutes of meeting me. When I took her out for our first date to a small, loud pizza place instead of a 5-star restaurant, she didn't complain. She actually ate the pizza with her hands and got sauce on her chin. For a guy who spent his life analyzing complex data structures, she felt like a breath of fresh air, a variable I wanted in my life permanently. I knew she came from money. You can tell by the way people carry themselves, the way they assume the world will just automatically accommodate them. But I didn't care. I loved her. Then came the welcome dinner. 2 weeks after I proposed to Chloe, she brought me to Connecticut to officially meet the Holloway family. I knew it was going to be an audition, but I had no idea the verdict had been decided before I even walked through the door. I remember walking into that same grand foyer 3 years ago. Eleanor looked me up and down. Her eyes scanned my off-the-rack suit, my scuffed dress shoes, the calluses on my hands. I could see the exact moment she categorized me. After the dinner, which was full of polite, interrogating questions from David about my little computer business, Eleanor pulled me aside. She asked me to join her in the library. The library was a massive room smelling of old paper, leather bindings, and expensive scotch. She sat across from me in a wingback chair, resting her hands on her lap. "I want to be honest with you, Matthew," she had said, using that quiet, terrifying voice, "because I think honesty is a form of respect. Chloe is generous. She loves easily. She trusts easily. Those are beautiful qualities in a person, but they are also vulnerabilities. You are from a very different environment. You didn't grow up with the burden of legacy." I sat perfectly still. "I grew up with different burdens, Eleanor." She offered a thin, patronizing smile. "I'm sure you did, and I'm sure you are very ambitious. But I need you to understand that this family will always protect itself. We built this wealth and we guard it. Whatever your intentions are, and I will take you at your word that you love my daughter, I need you to know that we are watching. We do not tolerate opportunists." She didn't ask about my company. She didn't ask about my dreams or my character. She looked at my zip code, she looked at my cheap suit, and she labeled me a gold digger. I had left that room, walked out into the cold night air, and sat in my car for 20 minutes before driving back to the hotel. I gripped the steering wheel so hard my knuckles popped. I thought about my mother. I thought about the executives who worked for me, the hundreds of employees who relied on my vision. And I thought about telling Eleanor exactly who she was dealing with. I wanted to crush her arrogance right then and there, but I didn't. I looked at Chloe, who was waiting for me, looking so hopeful, and I swallowed my pride. I told myself that they were just protective parents. I told myself that over time, if I just kept my head down, treated their daughter like a queen, and showed them respect, they would come around. They would see the man I truly was. That was my biggest mistake. I assumed they possessed the capacity for respect. The next 3 years of my marriage were a masterclass in psychological endurance. To the outside world, I was the lucky guy who married up. Inside the walls of the Holloway estate, I was a ghost. I was a punchline. Every family gathering, every holiday, every forced Sunday dinner was the same. David would hold court, talking loudly about the real estate market. Elijah would boast endlessly about his latest promotion at Trident Advisory, the high-profile clients he was managing, the bonus he was expecting. "You should see the new Porsche I'm looking at, Matt," Elijah would say, swirling his scotch. "Course, you probably wouldn't appreciate the engineering. Takes a certain kind of palate. How's the IT repair business going? You guys fix printers yet?" I would just smile and take a sip of my water. "We're managing, Elijah. Keeping the lights on." "Good for you, buddy," he would patronize, clapping me hard on the shoulder. Honest day's work for an honest day's pay. When Christmas came around, David bought Elijah a vintage Rolex. Eleanor bought Chloe diamond earrings. They handed me an envelope with a gift card to a chain steakhouse. It wasn't about the money. It was the message. The message was, "You are not one of us. You are a charity case we tolerate for our daughter's sake." Chloe tried to intervene at first. During the first year, she would argue with her mother, telling her to be nicer to me. But the Holloway family gravity was too strong. They slowly, patiently worked on her. They would make subtle comments when I wasn't around. They would plant seeds of doubt. "Are you sure his business is viable? He doesn't seem to be making any real money. You might have to support him forever, Chloe." Over time, she stopped fighting. She just wanted peace. So she asked me to just absorb it. "Just ignore them, Matt. It's just how they are." So I absorbed it. But while I was sitting quietly at their dining table, letting them insult my intelligence, I was aggressively conquering their world out in the corporate battlefield. Veeler Systems wasn't just growing. It was devouring everything in its path. We began acquiring smaller fintech companies. We expanded into algorithmic trading infrastructure. We started buying up distressed debt portfolios. I worked with my brilliant CFO, Caleb, building an empire from the shadows. The last public valuation of Veeler Systems, buried in a deep-dive financial report in the Wall Street Journal 14 months ago, was $2.1 billion. The entire Holloway family net worth, combining David's commercial properties, their investments, and the estate we were sitting in, was roughly $400 million. They were proud, loud millionaires. I was a silent billionaire. I could have bought their entire existence and liquidated it before lunch, and it wouldn't have even made a dent in my balance sheet. About 18 months ago, David's real estate firm made a massive miscalculation on a commercial development. They were heavily over-leveraged and the market shifted. He needed liquidity, and he needed it fast to keep his properties from going into foreclosure. He scrambled and managed to secure a $12 million commercial credit line to refinance 3 of the Holloway Group's crown jewel properties. The lending institution that threw him that lifeline was Meridian Capital Partners. What David didn't know, what he couldn't possibly have known because he never bothered to look past his own nose, was that 2 months prior to that panic loan, Veeler Systems had quietly acquired a controlling interest in Meridian Capital. I literally owned the debt on my father-in-law's legacy. I held the note to the Holloway empire. When Caleb brought me the paperwork for the acquisition and I saw the Holloway loan in the portfolio, I didn't celebrate. I just put the file in my private safe. I had no intention of weaponizing it. I believed in keeping business and family separate. I still stubbornly held onto the hope that one day, David would shake my hand like a man and respect me for being a good husband to his daughter. But sitting here at the Thanksgiving table, staring at a 14-page document designed to humiliate me, I realized that day was never going to come. Let's go back to the dinner table, to the exact moment the trap was sprung. "You're quiet, Matthew," David sneered, leaning forward. "Not used to seeing legal documents? Or maybe the big words are confusing you." I looked up from the paper. "I'm just wondering what prompted this sudden need for a postnup after 3 years of marriage." Elijah let out a sharp laugh. He reached into the inside pocket of his expensive tailored jacket and pulled out a single sheet of paper, folded into thirds. He tossed it onto the table. It landed right on top of the postnup. "We didn't just pull this out of thin air, Matt," Elijah said, his eyes gleaming with malicious joy. "We're finance guys. We do our due diligence. If my sister is going to be tied to a sinking ship, we have the right to know how deep the water is. I reached out and unfolded the paper. It was a tax filing. A corporate revenue report for a small LLC registered under my name. The total gross revenue listed for the previous fiscal year was exactly $48,000. My heart didn't race. Turned to ice. It wasn't panic that hit me. It was the sudden, sickening realization of betrayal. This specific document didn't belong to Velar Systems. It belonged to a tiny shell entity I had set up years ago specifically to handle minor administrative expenses, paying independent contractors for office maintenance, things like that. It had absolutely zero connection to my actual operating revenue. But there was only one person outside of my inner circle at Velar who had the security clearance to access this specific administrative file. Joseph. Joseph was a guy I went to college with. We shared a dorm room. When I started the company in the garage, he used to bring me coffee. A few years ago, he was going through a rough divorce and lost his job. He called me crying, begging for help. I created a mid-level accounting manager position for him just to get him back on his feet. I paid him a great salary. I invited him to my wedding. I trusted him. But Joseph always had a chip on his shoulder. He hated seeing me succeed while he struggled. He was always complaining, always looking for a shortcut. I stared at the $48,000 figure on the page. I knew exactly how Elijah got this. Elijah worked at Trident Advisory. He had the network. He must have figured out Joseph worked for me, taken him out to a fancy steakhouse, poured a few expensive drinks down his throat, and offered him a massive payout or a guaranteed job at Trident in exchange for dirt on me. And Joseph, the guy whose kids' Christmas presents I bought 2 years ago, sold me out for 30 pieces of silver. He handed Elijah the one document out of thousands that made me look like a complete, miserable failure. $48,000, Elijah said, savoring every single syllable. That's your grand empire. That's your life's work. You can't even afford the property taxes on Chloe's house, let alone support her. You are a fraud. He pointed a finger at me across the table. You've been lying to her this whole time, pretending to be some CEO, going to your little office every day, while you're barely making minimum wage. You're a parasite, Matt. The betrayal burned the back of my throat like cheap, toxic whiskey. I looked at the red stamp on the paper. Joseph's signature was right there at the bottom. We're not doing this to be cruel, Eleanor interjected, her voice dripping with fake sympathy. She reached for her wine glass. We are simply protecting Chloe's future. You came into this marriage with nothing. We want absolute clarity on what leaves with you when you eventually decide this lifestyle is too much pressure for you. They had orchestrated this entire night down to the minute. They bought the information from a trader, they drafted the legal papers, they set the table, and they waited until I was sitting in their house eating their food to spring the trap. They didn't just want a legal guarantee. They wanted a public execution of my dignity. David cleared his throat and nodded to Samuel again. The financial advisor adjusted his glasses. He didn't look at me. He looked at his notes. He was just a mercenary doing his job. Matthew, Samuel began, his tone perfectly flat and professional. The terms of this postnuptial agreement are quite standard for a family of this caliber, especially when there is a severe disparity in income and assets. Should the marriage dissolve for any reason, you will waive all rights to alimony or spousal support. You will waive any claim to properties, vehicles, or assets acquired during the marriage, as it is presumed they were purchased using Holloway funds or Chloe's trust. He flipped a page. Furthermore, there is a stipulation regarding future dependents. In the event of a divorce, you agree to waive any claim to seek child custody that would require the Holloway family to provide housing or financial maintenance for you. And finally, any future business ventures you attempt to start will be entirely separate from Chloe's assets. In exchange for your signature today, the family is willing to offer a one-time severance payment of $50,000 to help you transition out of the marriage. $50,000. I let that number hang in the air. They were trying to buy me off like a problematic, low-level employee. They were handing me a check that was barely a fraction of what I tipped my private pilots, and telling me to walk away from my wife. Think of it as a fresh start, David said, leaning back in his chair. thoroughly enjoying himself. You take the money, you sign the paper, and you stay married to my daughter under our rules. You live quietly. Or, you refuse, you pack your bags tonight, and my lawyers will drag you through a divorce so grueling, so humiliating, you'll be paying legal fees for the next 20 years. You won't have a dime left to your name. I felt a tight, suffocating knot forming in my chest. The sheer, unadulterated arrogance of it all. They weren't just asking for financial protection. They were demanding complete submission. They wanted me to admit I was inferior. They wanted me on a leash, grateful for the scraps they threw me. You've been living in our world for 3 years, Elijah chimed in, leaning forward. Eating our food, taking our vacations, sitting on our furniture. It's time to pay the toll, Maddie. Just sign the damn paper. I looked at the document again. The heavy paper, the aggressive legal jargon. It wasn't a contract. It was a declaration of war. And they thought they were bombing an unarmed village. The room fell quiet again. I hadn't spoken a single word since Elijah threw the tax return on the table. My silence seemed to agitate Eleanor. She liked people to react. She liked to see the panic in their eyes, the tears, the begging, so she could comfort them with her fake grace and assert her dominance. My stillness was unnerving her. Matthew, she said, her voice dropping an octave, taking on a much sharper edge. The mask of the polite society matron was slipping. Don't make this harder than it has to be. Look around you. Look at this house. Look at us. You don't belong here. You never did. I finally looked up from the table, meeting her cold, calculating gray eyes. We tried to be accommodating, she continued, folding her arms across her chest. We really did. We invited you into our home. But a tiger doesn't change its stripes. You were raised in a different environment. A desperate one. People from your background, they see wealth and they cling to it like a life raft. It's basic survival instinct. I don't even blame you for trying to secure a bag. She paused, making sure the entire table was listening, making sure every word landed precisely where she wanted it to. But you have to understand reality. We are not a charity. Your mother, rest her soul, did the best she could. I'm sure. Slinging hash at a diner is hard work. But she raised a man who looks for shortcuts. We build legacies. You look for handouts. Sign the paper. The air left my lungs. The blood in my veins stopped moving. She brought my mother into this. She used the woman who worked herself into an early grave, the woman who had more dignity, more honor, and more strength in her worn-out work shoes than Eleanor Holloway had in her entire miserable, privileged body, as a punchline to justify her snobbery. My hands, resting out of sight under the table, curled into tight fists. My nails dug into my palms so hard I could feel the skin breaking. A cold, absolute fury settled over me. It wasn't the hot, messy, screaming anger of a young man. It was the freezing, calculated, terrifying rage of a predator that had just been unleashed. I looked at David. I looked at Elijah. I looked at Eleanor. I memorized the smug, victorious satisfaction on their faces. I wanted to remember exactly how they looked in this moment of perceived victory, because I was about to wipe it off their faces forever. I was going to burn their little kingdom to the ground. But before I detonated the bomb, I needed to know one last thing. The only thing that actually mattered in this entire nightmare. I slowly turned my head and looked at Chloe, my wife, the woman I had promised to protect, the woman I had quietly built a massive empire for, hoping one day to surprise her with a life where she would never have to answer to her controlling parents again. She was still staring at her plate. Her shoulders were tense, pulled up toward her ears. She looked incredibly small. Chloe, I said. My voice was raspy, barely above a whisper, but it cut through the heavy silence of the dining room like a gunshot. She flinched violently. Did you know about this? I asked. She slowly raised her head. Her eyes were red, brimming with tears that she was trying desperately not to spill. She looked terrified, but the heartbreaking truth was, she wasn't terrified for me. She was terrified of the conflict. She was terrified of her father's wrath. Matt, please, She whispered, her voice trembling so badly she could barely get the words out. Just do what they ask. It's just a formality. It doesn't change how I feel about you. It's just paper. It just makes them feel secure. Please, don't fight them. I stared at her. I searched her eyes for any sign of fight, any sign of loyalty, any spark of the woman I thought I had married. I looked for the woman who ate pizza with her hands and laughed at my jokes. There was nothing. Just a scared little girl who would rather throw her husband under a bus than stand up to her family. You knew, I stated. It wasn't a question anymore. The realization hit me like a physical blow to the stomach. They planned this whole ambush. They dug into my life. They bribed my friend. They insulted my dead mother. And you sat there in the car with me for 2 hours today, holding my hand, knowing exactly what was waiting for me. I tried to stop them. She sobbed, a tear finally escaping and rolling down her cheek. She reached out her hand to touch my arm. I pulled my arm away instantly. Her touch felt toxic, felt like a lie. But you didn't stop them, I said, my voice completely hollow. That was it. That was the bottom of the abyss. The crushing, suffocating weight of realizing that the past 3 years of my life were a complete illusion. I had been fighting a silent war to prove my worth to a family that was fundamentally incapable of valuing me. For a woman who wouldn't even stand by my side in the trenches. The last tether holding me to this family, the last shred of obligation I felt toward this marriage, simply snapped. There was nothing left to protect. Time seemed to slow down. I sat there in the massive dining room, surrounded by antique silver, imported flowers, and toxic people, and I felt incredibly, beautifully clear-headed. For 3 years I had played their game. I had worn the cheap suits so I wouldn't threaten Elijah's ego. I had smiled at David's insults. I had let Eleanor treat me like the help. I did it because I believed that being the bigger person meant absorbing the blows. I believed that my massive success didn't need to be weaponized. I believed that real power was quiet. But looking at Chloe's tear-stained face, looking at Elijah's sneering grin, looking at Eleanor's cold eyes, I realized a fundamental truth about the world. Some people do not respect humility. They only respect power. If you let them treat you like a doormat, they will wipe their dirty feet on you every single day of your life. They thought they had done their due diligence. They thought that $48,000 fake tax return was the smoking gun that proved I was a loser. They were so blinded by their own arrogance, so convinced of their own genetic superiority, that they never bothered to look 1 inch deeper. They never asked the right questions. They wanted a gold digger? Fine. I would show them exactly what money looked like. I took a deep breath. The suffocating feeling in my chest evaporated. It was replaced by a strange, buzzing, calm energy. I wasn't the poor kid from Akron anymore. I wasn't the pathetic charity case son-in-law. I was the CEO and majority shareholder of Veeler Systems. I was the man who moved millions of dollars before he drank his morning coffee. And I was about to tear this family's false reality down to the studs. I reached out for my crystal water glass. I took a slow, deliberate sip. Then, I set it down perfectly in the center of the coaster. Every eye at the table was glued to me. They were waiting for me to break. They were waiting for the apologies, the begging, the tears, or the angry, impotent outburst of a defeated man. I gave them nothing. I reached out and picked up the heavy silver pen lying next to the contract. David smiled, a broad, ugly smile of triumph. He assumed he had won. Eleanor relaxed her rigid posture, sinking back into her chair. Elijah actually let out a short, victorious laugh and picked up his wine glass for a toast. I looked at the pen in my hand. It was beautiful, perfectly balanced, heavy. I looked at the signature line on the 14th page of the contract, right next to where Samuel had placed a yellow sticky note that said, "Sign here." Then, very calmly, without breaking eye contact with David, I tossed the pen across the table. It flew through the air and clattered violently against Elijah's wine glass with a sharp, ringing sound, before spinning off the table and hitting the hardwood floor. "I'm not signing it," I said. My voice wasn't loud. I didn't yell. but it possessed a weight, a heavy, unyielding gravity that instantly froze the room. David's triumphant smile vanished instantly. He leaned forward, gripping the edge of the table, his face flushing a deep, angry red. "Excuse me? I don't think you understand your position here. Boy, you do not have leverage. You sign that paper right now, or you are out on the street tonight with nothing but the clothes on your back." "I understand my position perfectly, David," I replied, holding his furious gaze without blinking. "I understand exactly where I sit at this table. The problem is, none of you have a damn clue who you're sitting across from." "Oh, please," Eleanor scoffed, rolling her eyes in exaggerated disgust. "Spare us the wounded pride act, Matthew. It's tiresome. We caught you. Just accept it. You brought my mother into this," I said, my voice dropping to a dangerous, lethal register. "You called me a parasite. You put a fake dollar amount on my worth and used it to threaten my marriage." I stood up slowly. The heavy wooden chair scraped loudly against the floor. I didn't slouch. I stood at my full height, looking down at them. "You want a divorce?" I asked, looking directly down at David. "You want to file the papers on Monday morning? Save your expensive lawyer the billable hours. I'll file them myself." Chloe gasped loudly, burying her face in her hands and sobbing. "You're a fool," David spat, his voice shaking with rage. "You're walking away with absolutely nothing. You'll be ruined." "David," I said, a grim, humorless smile forming on my lips, "I walked into this house with more power than you have accumulated in your entire lifetime. You just never bothered to ask the right questions." Elijah slammed his hand flat on the table, rattling the silverware. He stood up, squaring his shoulders, trying to physically intimidate me across the linen. "Who do you think you are?" Elijah barked, his face contorted with anger and disbelief. "You're a fraud, Matt. You're a broke, pathetic loser trying to play tough guy. We have the documents. We have your tax returns. You make 48 grand a year. You're nothing. You hear me? Nothing." He reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone, waving it at me like a weapon. "You want to play hardball? Fine. I'm calling my lawyer right now. We'll have security throw you out of here for trespassing." "Call him," I challenged, not taking a single step back. My voice was eerily calm. "In fact, put him on speaker. I'd love to hear his legal advice when the dust settles in about 5 minutes." Samuel, the financial advisor, stood up nervously, holding his hands out in a placating gesture, trying to de-escalate the situation. "Matthew, please. Emotions are running incredibly high right now. Let's all sit down and approach this logically. Posturing and making threats won't change the financial reality of the situation." "You're absolutely right, Samuel," I said, turning my head to look at him. "Posturing doesn't change reality. Data changes reality. And your data is fundamentally flawed." "Don't listen to him," Eleanor snapped, finally losing her cool, collected composure. Her voice was shrill. "He's bluffing. He's cornered and he's lying. He has nothing. Get him out of my house, David. Right now." "I'm leaving," I said. "But before I walk out that door, I'm going to leave you a little holiday gift. You wanted full transparency regarding my finances? You wanted to know exactly what leaves with me when this marriage ends." I bent down and grabbed the leather briefcase I had brought with me. I placed it squarely on top of their pristine, white linen table, right next to the roasted turkey and the crystal glasses. "What are you doing?" David demanded, pointing a thick finger at me. "Get that cheap bag off my table." I ignored him. I pulled my phone out of my pocket. I opened my secure messaging app and found the thread with Caleb, my chief financial officer. Caleb had been on standby all night. He knew this dinner was going to go south. He just didn't know how fast or how ugly it would get. I typed a 2-word message, "Activate protocol." I hit send. The trap was sprung. Then I looked across the table at Elijah. He was still holding his phone, looking slightly confused, trying to figure out if he should actually dial the lawyer or not. His arrogance was starting to crack, just a little bit, replaced by a tiny sliver of doubt. "Elijah," I said, My voice dead calm, cutting through the tension. You work at Trident Advisory, right? Senior VP of Investments? Big shot handling the massive portfolios. He sneered, gripping his phone tighter. You know exactly what I do. And it's a hell of a lot more important than whatever fake IT gig you pretend to run. You're right, I nodded slowly, deliberately. It's a very important job, especially when you're managing private family portfolios and dealing with SEC regulations. Do me a favor, Elijah. Open the web browser on your phone. I'm not playing games with you, Matt, he spat. Do it, I commanded. The sudden, overwhelming authority in my voice made him physically hesitate. Just humor him, Elijah, David growled, crossing his arms. Let him make a fool of himself before we throw him out into the cold. Elijah aggressively tapped his screen, opening his mobile browser. He glared at me. Fine. What? Type in Velar Systems, I instructed. VLAR. Then click on the Wall Street Journal article from last month regarding their latest corporate acquisition. Read it. Elijah typed furiously, shaking his head in disgust. Velar Systems. Whatever. You probably fixed their broken printers. His voice trailed off. The dining room went dead silent. The only sound was the ticking of the grandfather clock in the hallway. I watched his eyes scan the bright screen of his phone. I watched the arrogant, mocking smirk slowly melt off his face, replaced by a look of sheer, unadulterated confusion. He blinked hard. He brought the phone closer to his face, squinting, as if the words on the screen were written in a foreign language. His mouth opened slightly. What? Elijah whispered. The color rapidly drained from his cheeks, leaving him looking sickly and pale. This is a typo. This has to be fake. This is a joke. What is it? David asked, leaning over, his brow furrowed in sudden concern. Elijah slowly looked up from the screen. He looked at me. His hands were visibly trembling. The golden boy wasn't looking so golden anymore. He looked like a man who had just stepped on a landmine and heard the click. Read it aloud. Elijah, I said, popping the brass locks on my briefcase with a sharp, echoing click. Read the name of the founder and CEO of Velar Systems, and read the company's valuation to your father. I slid a thick, heavy manila folder out of my briefcase and held it in my hand. The storm had arrived. Elijah's eyes were locked onto the screen of his phone. His breathing had completely stopped. He looked like a man who had just been thrown out of an airplane without a parachute, watching the ground rush up to meet him. Elijah, David barked, his voice laced with sudden, sharp anxiety. What does it say? Read it. Elijah couldn't form the words. His jaw worked up and down, but no sound came out. He slowly lowered the phone, his hands shaking so violently that the device almost slipped from his grip. He looked at me, and for the first time in 3 years the sneer was gone. The condescension was gone. There was only absolute naked terror in his eyes. Give me that, David snapped, snatching the phone directly out of his son's hand. David adjusted his reading glasses and looked at the screen. I watched the exact moment his reality shattered. It was fascinating. It didn't happen all at once. First, his brow furrowed in annoyance. Then his eyes widened. Then the color drained out of his face, starting from his neck and moving upward until he looked like a wax figure. This is, David started, his voice cracking. He cleared his throat and tried again. This says Velar Systems was recently valued at $2.1 billion. And it names Matthew as the sole founder and majority shareholder. Eleanor let out a sharp, dismissive laugh. It sounded brittle and panicked. Don't be ridiculous, David. It's a mistake. A typo. Or he paid someone to put that on the internet. Anyone can make a fake website. It's the Wall Street Journal, Eleanor, David whispered, staring at the screen. He looked up at me, his eyes wide and completely lost. How? How is this possible? I founded Velar when I was 24, I said, my voice steady and completely devoid of emotion. The $48,000 on the tax return your son bought from my former employee belongs to a shell entity. I use it to pay the landscaping company that mows the lawn at our corporate office. It has absolutely nothing to do with the operating company. I picked up the postnuptial agreement they had placed in front of me and held it up. I understand why you had this drawn up, I said, looking right into David's eyes. You thought you were protecting your family. You thought the math was simple. You thought I was a guy who had everything to gain and absolutely nothing to offer. You looked at my cheap suit and my old car, and you made a calculation. I dropped the heavy paper back onto the table. It landed with a dull thud. But your math was wrong, I continued. Your total family net worth, including this house, your investments, and your commercial real estate holdings, is roughly $400 million. That is a respectable number. But in my world, David, $400 million is a rounding error. The room was so quiet you could hear the hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen down the hall. Chloe was staring at me, her mouth slightly open, tears frozen on her cheeks. She looked at me like I was a complete stranger. And in that moment the submissive, quiet husband was dead. This is a trick, Elijah suddenly shouted, slamming his hands on the table. He was trying to claw back his authority, but his voice was shrill and desperate. You're running a Ponzi scheme. You're going to jail. Nobody makes that kind of money without leaving a trail. I work in finance, Matt. I know how this works. You do work in finance, Elijah, I agreed calmly. I reached into the manila folder I had pulled from my briefcase. I slid a single, crisp document across the table toward him. Which brings me to my next point. Elijah looked down at the paper. 18 months ago, I said, shifting my gaze back to David. Your real estate firm took out a $12 million commercial credit line to refinance 3 of your major properties. The lending institution you used was Meridian Capital Partners. David swallowed hard. He nodded slowly. Yes, we did. So what? In November of last year, I said, I acquired a controlling interest in Meridian Capital. That means, as of that acquisition, I hold the note on your credit line. David physically recoiled. He pushed himself back in his chair, putting distance between himself and the table. The line is in technical default as of 30 days ago. I continued, my voice merciless and flat. The balloon payment due last month was missed. Not by much, David, but missed. Under the terms of the loan agreement you signed, I have the legal right to call the entire loan due immediately. If you cannot pay the $12 million in cash by tomorrow morning, I have the right to seize the 3 properties you put up as collateral. You can't do that, David gasped, his chest heaving. Those properties are the anchor of my entire portfolio. If you take those, the whole company collapses. The cross-collateralization will trigger defaults on every other loan I have. Sit down, David, I commanded. The authority in my voice was so absolute, so heavy, that David Holloway, a man who had commanded rooms for 40 years, actually sank back into his chair. I am not calling the loan, I said. I have no interest in destabilizing your company. I have no interest in your money. What I have is documentation. And what I want is for every single person at this table to understand exactly what the actual power dynamic in this room looks like. I turned my attention back to Elijah. He was still staring at the piece of paper I had slid toward him. He was sweating now. Actual beads of sweat were forming on his forehead. Since we are so focused on due diligence tonight, I said, leaning forward slightly. Let's talk about the account you've been running through Trident Advisory. Elijah's head snapped up. His eyes were wide with pure panic. Don't. You manage a private offshore fund for 3 high-net-worth clients, I stated. I wasn't asking. I was telling him. Over the last 6 months, that account made a series of highly aggressive, perfectly timed trades on Pelios Pharma right before their FDA filing timeline was announced. Samuel, the financial advisor, suddenly sat up very straight. He knew exactly what I was talking about. Trading ahead of an unannounced FDA filing is a federal crime. The source of your information, I continued, was a contact you have at Strickland Financial. You paid him under the table to leak the timeline. That's a lie, Elijah choked out. You have no proof of that. You're making things up to scare us. Strickland Financial was acquired by one of my subsidiary companies in September, I said softly. Their internal communications, their server logs, their employee emails, are all now subject to Veeler Systems compliance review. We found the emails, Elijah. We found the wire transfers from your offshore account to his. Eleanor grabbed her husband's arm. David, what is he saying? Make him stop talking. I forwarded the complete file, including your email correspondence and the transaction history, to the Securities and Exchange Commission's Whistleblower Division 6 days ago, I said. The silence that followed wasn't just quiet. It was the sound of a life ending. Elijah opened his mouth, but no words came out. He looked at his father. He looked at his mother. Then he looked at the front windows of the dining room. The heavy drapes were pulled back. Through the glass I could see the long, dark driveway. And moving slowly up that driveway were two sets of bright headlights. That would be the federal compliance team, I said, looking out the window. They are not here for Turkey. Two black Porsche Cayennes pulled up to the front of the house, parking at sharp angles to block the driveway. The doors opened, and several men and women in dark suits stepped out into the cold night air. This is insane, Eleanor screamed, finally shattering her calm facade. She stood up, her chair crashing to the floor behind her. You cannot do this in my home. We are the Holloways. David, do something. I authorized a voluntary disclosure with the SEC. I explained calmly, ignoring her screaming. Because my company now owns the entity that facilitated your son's crime, I was legally obligated to report it. They asked me to be present for the initial interview. I suggested they do it here at the house to keep it out of the public eye. You should be thanking me, Elijah. If they picked you up at your office on Wall Street, you'd be on the evening news by 6 o'clock. The front doorbell rang. It was a loud, melodic chime that echoed through the massive house. It sounded like a funeral bell. I want to be very clear, I said, standing up and buttoning my suit jacket. I did not engineer this dinner. I did not arrange for any of this to happen tonight. You called me here. You put that document next to my plate. You chose to ambush me. You chose to insult my mother. I just came prepared. David put his face in his hands. He looked like he had aged 20 years in 20 minutes. Samuel, the advisor, was quickly packing his briefcase, desperate to get out of the blast radius. The housekeeper walked nervously into the dining room. Mr. Holloway? There are some federal agents at the door. They say they have a warrant for Elijah. Let them in, I told her. Elijah didn't run. He didn't fight. He just sat there, staring at the table, completely broken. The Golden Boy's entire life was over. He was looking at years in federal prison, the total destruction of his career, and the ruin of his reputation. All because he thought he was smarter than everyone else. All because he thought he could crush a guy from Akron just for fun. Agent Carter, a tall man in a dark overcoat, walked into the dining room holding a badge. Two other agents flanked him. Elijah Holloway? Carter asked. Elijah slowly stood up. He didn't say a word. The agents moved in, turned him around, and placed him in handcuffs right there in the formal dining room. The metal clicked loudly. Eleanor rushed forward, grabbing Agent Carter's arm. You can't take him. He's a good boy. This is a misunderstanding. My husband knows the governor. Ma'am, please step back, Carter said firmly, gently pushing her away. He looked over at me and gave a brief, professional nod. I nodded back. They marched Elijah out of the room. Eleanor collapsed onto the floor, sobbing hysterically, burying her face in her hands. David just sat at the table, staring blankly at the wall. His empire was entirely at my mercy. His son was going to prison, and his pride was completely shattered. I picked up my briefcase. Chloe suddenly jumped up from her chair and ran around the table. She grabbed my arm, her fingers digging into my jacket. Her face was stained with makeup and tears. Matt, she cried, her voice desperate. Matt, please, we can fix this. I didn't know it was going to be like this. I love you. Please don't leave me. We can go home. We can forget all of this. I stopped and looked down at her hand gripping my arm. Then I looked into her eyes. You didn't know it was going to be like this? I asked softly. You knew they were going to humiliate me. You knew they were going to force me to sign away my rights. You just didn't know I could fight back. You're not sorry they did it, Chloe. You're just sorry they lost. No, she sobbed, shaking her head violently. That's not true. I was just scared. You know my father. You know how he is. I do know how he is, I said. And I know how you are. You made your choice in the car ride over here. You made your choice when you looked down at your plate instead of standing up for your husband. I reached over and gently, but firmly, peeled her fingers off my jacket. I never hid from you, I said to her, and then I looked at David and Eleanor. I never hid from any of you. I was right here the whole time. You just never bothered to look. I turned around and walked out of the dining room. I didn't look back. I walked through the grand foyer, past the stunned housekeeper, and out the heavy oak front doors. The November air was brutally cold, but it felt incredibly clean. It felt like waking up from a long, suffocating nightmare. The gravel crunched loudly under my shoes as I walked past the SEC vehicles. At the end of the driveway, waiting just outside the iron gates, was a black Rolls-Royce Phantom. My head of security and personal driver, Lincoln, was standing by the open rear door. He saw me coming and gave a slight nod. Good evening, Mr. CEO, Lincoln said. Evening, Lincoln, I replied, stepping into the warm, quiet interior of the car. Let's go home. As we drove away, I looked out the tinted window. I saw the massive stone house sitting on the hill. Every window was lit up. It looked beautiful from the outside, but I knew the rot that lived inside those walls. I didn't feel triumphant. I didn't feel a massive rush of joy. I just felt a profound sense of relief. The burden of pretending to be someone lesser was finally gone. 6 months passed. A lot changes in 6 months when you completely alter the trajectory of your life. I was standing by the floor-to-ceiling windows in my corner office on the top floor of Velar Systems headquarters. The view of the city skyline was incredible. The morning sun was reflecting off the glass towers, painting the city in gold. The door to my office opened, and Caleb, my CFO, walked in carrying a tablet. Caleb was the guy who had been with me since the garage days. He was fiercely loyal and brilliant. Morning, Matt, Caleb said, dropping into one of the leather chairs. Just went over the quarterly numbers. The Meridian Capital integration is complete. We're showing a 12% increase in overall revenue across the subsidiary board. Good work, Caleb, I said, turning away from the window. What about the Holloway situation? Caleb sighed and scrolled on his tablet. It's ugly. David Holloway filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy protection yesterday. Without the Meridian credit line, and with the bad press from Elijah's arrest, his other lenders got spooked and called their notes. The commercial real estate firm is going into receivership. He's liquidating his assets. They're putting the estate in Connecticut on the market next week. I nodded slowly. I didn't smile. It was just business. Actions have consequences. And Joseph? I asked. Fired from Trident Advisory the day after the dinner, Caleb replied. Turns out, when the SEC started digging into Elijah's files, they found all the emails Joseph sent him containing your fake tax documents. Joseph breached his confidentiality agreement with us. I had our legal team send a warning to every major accounting firm in the tri-state area. He is completely blacklisted. He's currently working night shifts at a warehouse. Keep an eye on him, I said. Don't let him near our systems again. Understood, Caleb said, standing up. You have a meeting with Gabriel at 10. The final paperwork. Thanks, Caleb. At 10 o'clock, I walked into the conference room. My personal lawyer, Gabriel, was sitting at the table. Across from him sat Chloe and her attorney. Chloe looked entirely different. She wasn't wearing expensive designer clothes. Her hair wasn't perfectly styled. She looked tired. The stress of the last 6 months. Her brother going to federal prison. Her father losing his fortune. Her mother falling into a deep depression had taken a massive toll on her. I sat down across from her. She couldn't meet my eyes. Gabriel slid a folder across the table. It wasn't 14 pages of threats. It was a standard, clean divorce settlement. As we discussed, Gabriel said to Chloe's lawyer, Matthew is under no legal obligation to provide spousal support, given the brevity of the marriage and the fact that all assets were acquired prior to the union under the Wheeler holding structure. However, Matthew has authorized a one-time severance payment of $500,000 to Chloe. It is enough to buy a modest condo and start over. Chloe's head snapped up. She looked at me, her eyes wide with shock. $50,000 was what they offered me to walk away with nothing. I was giving her $500,000, not because I owed her, not because I still loved her. I was doing it because I am not them. I do not kick people when they are completely destroyed. I believe in mercy, but I only offer it from a position of absolute strength. Matt, Chloe whispered, her voice breaking. You don't have to do this. I don't deserve this. I know you don't, I said gently, but you're going to need it. Take the money, Chloe. Buy a place. Figure out who you are without your parents whispering in your ear. Have a good life. She picked up the pen. Her hand was shaking, just like it had been at the Thanksgiving table. But this time she signed her name. She pushed the paper back across the table, stood up, and walked out of the room. That was the last time I ever saw her. When I look back on that night, the night I slid that folder across the dining room table, I realized it wasn't just about money. It was never about the money. The money was just a tool. It was about respect. It was about knowing your own value when the entire world is trying to tell you that you are worthless. The Holloway family thought that their zip code, their trust funds, and their country club memberships made them superior human beings. They thought they could print out a piece of paper and erase my dignity. But true power doesn't come from a trust fund. True power comes from the dirt. It comes from surviving the worst days of your life. It comes from building something with your own two hands while everyone else is sleeping. They looked at me and saw a guy in a cheap suit. They should have seen the guy who survived the midnight shifts, the empty bank accounts, and the terrifying leaps of faith. They should have seen the wolf hiding among the sheep. Thank you for sticking around and listening to my story. I know it was a long one, but it's a chapter of my life that fundamentally changed how I view the world. I hope this resonated with you in some way. We live in a society that constantly tries to put a price tag on our worth based on what we drive, what we wear, or where we came from. Never let anyone hand you a piece of paper and tell you what your life amounts to. Have you ever found yourself in a similar situation? Have you ever had to sit across the table from people who constantly underestimated you, only to finally show them what you're really made of? Tell me about it in the comments below. I read them all. Now, if you made it all the way to this exact moment, you are part of a very small group. You are part of what I call the 1% Club. I want you to go down to the comments section right now and type the letter W. W stands for winner. That is our secret code. When I see that W, I know you are someone who appreciates the journey, someone who stays until the very end, and someone who understands that the best revenge is simply massive success. If you enjoyed this story, please hit that like button and make sure you follow the channel. We have a lot more stories to share, and I want you to be here for the next one. Until then, keep building, keep working, and never let them see you coming.